The day my marriage ended. If someone had told me 10 years ago that the man I loved would one day walk out of our apartment carrying a suitcase, and then 5 years later walk back into my life asking me for a job, I would have laughed. Not because I thought our marriage was perfect, but because I never imagined life could be that ironic. My name is Emma. I'm 36 years old now, and I own a software consulting company with offices in 3 cities. People who meet me today think I've always been successful. They see the office, the employees, the awards on the wall, and assume everything came easily. What they don't see is the woman who once sat alone on a tiny apartment floor, wondering how she was going to pay rent after her husband left. His name was Daniel. We met when we were both 24. I worked as an administrative assistant at a logistics company. Daniel was a junior sales executive. He wasn't rich. Neither was I. But we had dreams. Or at least, I thought we shared the same dreams. Back then, we couldn't afford expensive dates. Friday nights meant buying takeout and watching old movies on our secondhand couch. We laughed over burned dinners. We celebrated tiny victories. When Daniel got a small promotion, we went out for burgers because that was all we could afford. It felt like luxury. He used to hold my hand and say, "One day we'll look back at all this and smile." I believed every word. 2 years later, we got married. Nothing extravagant. Just close family, a small church, and a backyard reception at my parents' house. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt real. For the first few years, life wasn't exciting. Bills, work, groceries, weekend laundry. The ordinary things that make up a marriage. And honestly, I loved it. Because I wasn't chasing perfection. I just wanted peace. Daniel, however, started changing. It happened slowly. At first it was harmless. Longer hours at work. More business dinners. Weekend meetings. I didn't question it. He was ambitious. I admired that. Then one evening, he came home wearing an expensive watch. I'd never seen it before. I smiled. "Did you finally buy yourself something nice?" He hesitated. "My boss gave it to me after we closed a big deal." It sounded unusual, but I let it go. Over the next few months, our conversations became shorter. Dinner became silent. Phones stayed on the table. His always face down. Mine didn't. Every time his phone buzzed, he smiled. Not at me. At the screen. One night I asked, "Everything okay?" Without looking up, he answered, "Just work." That answer became his favorite sentence. Just work. Just work. Just work. Then came the canceled anniversaries. The forgotten birthdays. The late-night emails. Or at least, that's what he called them. I started eating dinner alone more often than with him. Sometimes he'd come home after midnight. Other nights, he wouldn't come home at all. His explanation was always the same. The clients needed me. I wanted to believe him. Because sometimes believing a lie hurts less than accepting the truth. My best friend Sarah noticed before I did. One afternoon we were having coffee when she looked at me and asked, "Emma, are you okay?" I forced a smile. "I'm fine." "No, you're pretending." I laughed. "Daniel's just busy." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out the cafe window. Then quietly she said, "I saw him." I frowned. Saw him where? At Riverside Hotel. I felt my stomach tighten. He was having lunch with a woman. I smiled anyway. Probably a client. Sarah looked directly into my eyes. It didn't look like a business meeting. I remember getting angry. Not at Daniel. At Sarah. I defended him. "You don't know what you saw." She nodded. "I hope you're right." Looking back, I wish she hadn't been. Weeks passed. Then months. The distance between us grew wider every day. One Saturday morning, Daniel told me he had to fly to Chicago for a conference. 3 days. That evening, while doing laundry, I found his passport. Still inside the drawer. He hadn't taken it. My heart skipped. Maybe it was a domestic flight. Maybe he didn't need it. I kept making excuses for him. That's what love does. It teaches you how to ignore the obvious. Sunday afternoon. I drove to the grocery store. On my way home, I stopped at a traffic light. A black Mercedes pulled up beside me. I wasn't paying attention until I recognized the driver. Daniel. He wasn't in Chicago. He wasn't alone either. In the passenger seat was a woman I'd never seen before. Elegant. Confident. She laughed. He reached across and held her hand. Then, he kissed her. The light turned green. Cars behind me started honking. I couldn't move. Everything around me became blurry. My hands were shaking so badly. I had to pull over. I sat there crying for nearly 20 minutes. Not loud, just silent tears. The kind that leave your chest feeling empty. That evening, I waited. At 9 o'clock, he walked through the front door. Calm. Relaxed. Still wearing the same blue shirt. I looked at him. He smiled. "How was your weekend?" I couldn't believe he asked. I whispered, "How was Chicago?" He froze. Only for a second. Then he recovered. "It was fine." I nodded. "I saw you today." Silence. His face changed. Not guilty. Annoyed. Like I'd interrupted something. Finally, he sighed. "I guess there's no point hiding it anymore." Those words hurt more than finding out. Because they meant he had already stopped caring. I asked the question every wife dreads. "Who is she?" He answered without emotion. "Her name is Victoria." "Your boss?" He nodded. "Yes." I stared at him. "For how long?" He looked away. "Almost a year." A year. 365 days. Of lies. Instead, I whispered. "Why?" He rubbed his forehead. "Victoria understands my ambitions." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So I don't." He shook his head. "You've always been comfortable living small." Living small. Those two words echoed in my mind. I'd supported him through every promotion, every failure, every late night, every career change. I'd worked overtime so we could pay bills while he chased opportunities. And now, I was the reason he wanted to leave? I looked at him. "What are you saying?" He took a deep breath. "I'm leaving." The room became painfully quiet. For her. Yes. I felt something inside me break. Not because he loved someone else, but because he had already packed his future. Without telling me, he walked into the bedroom, opened the closet, pulled out a suitcase. It was already half full. He had planned everything. For weeks. Maybe months. As he zipped the suitcase closed, he looked at me one last time. There wasn't sadness in his eyes. There wasn't regret. Only confidence. The kind of confidence people have when they think they're making the best decision of their lives. Then he said the sentence I would never forget. "Emma, you'll never make it without me." He picked up his suitcase, opened the front door, and walked away. I stood there listening to his footsteps disappear down the hallway. I thought that was the end of my story. I had no idea. It was only the beginning. The hardest years of my life. The silence after Daniel left was unbearable. For the first few minutes, I couldn't move. I just stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the front door. Part of me expected him to walk back in, to say it was all a mistake, to tell me he didn't mean any of it. But he never came back. That night, I slept on the couch because I couldn't bear to walk into our bedroom. His side of the closet was empty. His toothbrush was gone. Even his favorite coffee mug had disappeared. He hadn't left in the heat of an argument. He had planned his exit. Every single detail. The next morning, I still had to go to work. Life doesn't pause just because your heart is broken. I remember standing in front of the bathroom mirror. My eyes were swollen. My face looked exhausted. I almost called in sick. Instead, I washed my face, put on a little makeup, and forced myself out the door. At the office, everyone smiled like it was a normal Monday. No one knew my marriage had ended 12 hours earlier. When people asked how my weekend was, I smiled. Pretty quiet. Sometimes pretending is easier than explaining. For the next few weeks, I lived on autopilot. Wake up. Go to work. Come home. Cry. Sleep. Repeat. Then the divorce papers arrived. No handwritten note. No apology. Just legal documents. Daniel wanted everything settled quickly. Apparently, Victoria didn't want complications. Reading those papers felt colder than the day he left. 7 years together. Reduced to signatures. My lawyer asked if I wanted to fight for more. I looked at the paperwork. There wasn't much to fight over. We had never been wealthy. The apartment was rented. The savings account was nearly empty. Most of our money had gone toward helping Daniel build his career. Ironically, the only investment that had paid off was his future. One afternoon, Sarah came over carrying grocery bags. She looked around my apartment. "You haven't been eating, have you?" I shrugged. "I've just been busy." She opened my refrigerator. It was almost empty. She turned around and folded her arms. "Emma, enough." Without asking, she started cooking. We sat at my tiny kitchen table eating pasta. For the first time in weeks, I actually laughed. Sarah looked at me carefully. "You know what bothers me the—" Her voice was firm. "He convinced you that you were small because it made him feel bigger." Those words stayed with me. For days, maybe weeks. I kept hearing them every time self-doubt crept in. Around that time, something unexpected happened. Our company announced budget cuts. Several administrative positions were being eliminated. Mine included. I had just lost my husband. Now I had lost my job. I drove home in complete silence. When I opened my banking app that evening, reality hit me. After rent, utilities, insurance, and groceries, I had enough money to survive for maybe 3 months. That was it. Fear became my new roommate. Every purchase suddenly felt expensive. Coffee, gas, even shampoo. I started selling things online. The television, old furniture, designer handbags I'd barely used. One by one, my apartment became emptier. Sometimes I'd sit on the floor because I'd already sold the chair. One evening, while updating my resume, I realized something. For years, I had helped organize projects at work, coordinated teams, managed client schedules, solved operational problems. I wasn't just an assistant. I was a problem solver. I'd simply never given myself credit. That realization changed everything. Instead of applying only for office jobs, I started offering freelance project management services online. The first month, nothing happened. The second month, one small client hired me. The project paid just $600. I celebrated like I'd won the lottery. Not because of the money, because someone believed my skills had value. I worked 18-hour days. I answered emails at midnight, joined meetings before sunrise. Every satisfied client brought another referral. Slowly, work became steady. Then something surprising happened. One of my clients asked, "Emma, why don't you start your own consulting company?" I laughed. "Because companies aren't built by people like me." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm just me." He smiled. And I didn't have an answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Daniel's words. "You'll never make it without me." For months, those words had haunted me. But suddenly, they sounded different. Not like a prediction, like a challenge. The following Monday, I walked into the county clerk's office. My hands were shaking as I filled out the paperwork. Business name, owner, address, signature. When I handed the forms over, the clerk smiled. "Congratulations." "For what?" "You're officially a business owner." Business owner. The words felt unreal. My company started in my tiny apartment. No employees. No fancy office. Just one laptop. One folding table. And a dream I hadn't known I possessed. I did everything myself. Sales. Invoices. Marketing. Customer support. Bookkeeping. Cleaning. Some days I worked until 2 in the morning. Other days, I wondered if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Money remained tight. There were weeks when I skipped buying new clothes because every dollar mattered. I drove an old sedan that made strange noises every morning. But every month, the business grew. Slowly. Painfully. One client became 3. 3 became 8. 8 became 15. By the end of the second year, I hired my first employee. Her name was Melissa. She was nervous during the interview. She apologized twice for not having enough experience. I smiled because she reminded me of myself. I hired her anyway. Best decision I ever made. She worked hard. She cared about our clients. Together, we built something special. One afternoon, Melissa walked into my office holding a contract. Emma. Her hands were shaking. You need to see this. It was the biggest proposal we'd ever received. A national retail company wanted to hire us for a year-long consulting project. The contract was worth more money than my entire business had earned during its first 2 years combined. I read the offer 3 times. I honestly thought there had been a mistake. There wasn't. We won the contract. The morning the first payment arrived, I cried. Not because I was rich. I wasn't. But because for the first time, I knew I was going to be okay. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was building. Months later, we moved into our first real office. Nothing luxurious. Just a modest space with white walls and secondhand furniture. But when I unlocked the door on our first day, I stood there smiling. 5 years earlier, I had been sitting on the floor of an almost empty apartment wondering how I'd pay rent. Now, people were trusting me to build their businesses. Sometimes life changes so slowly. You don't notice it until you stop and look back. One Friday afternoon, Melissa walked into my office carrying a business magazine. Emma, you made it. I looked confused. She placed the magazine on my desk. There I was, smiling on the cover. The headline read, "From Corporate Assistant to CEO, the woman helping businesses grow." I stared at the photo for several seconds. Not because I looked successful. Because I remembered the woman who once believed she was nothing. The woman who believed she'd never make it without her husband. I gently touched the magazine cover, then smiled. Not for Daniel. Not for revenge. For myself. Because I'd finally proven something. Not to the world. To the woman I used to be. I had no idea. That magazine was about to find its way into the hands of someone who never expected to see my face again. The interview that changed everything. 5 years. That's how long it had been since Daniel walked out of my life. 5 years since he looked me in the eyes and said, "You'll never make it without me." Ironically, those words became the fuel that kept me going whenever I wanted to quit. Life had finally settled into a rhythm. Our company now employed more than 80 people. We had clients across the country. Every Monday morning, I'd walk through the office greeting employees by name. It never stopped feeling surreal. He wore a plain navy jacket that looked several years old. When he heard the door open, he turned around. For a second, neither of us spoke. His eyes widened. "Emma." I smiled politely. "Hello, Daniel." He looked completely frozen. I didn't know that this was my company?" He slowly nodded. "I had no idea." I pulled out a chair. "Please, have a seat." He sat down carefully, still staring at me as if none of this made sense. I opened his resume. Professional. Calm. Exactly as I would with any applicant. "So," I said, "tell me about yourself." He blinked. "You want to do the interview?" "Of course." Another long silence followed. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I've worked in corporate sales for over 12 years. "I see." He continued explaining his experience, his achievements, his leadership skills. I listened carefully, taking notes, just as I did with every candidate. Then I asked, "I noticed you've changed jobs 3 times in the last 4 years. His confidence faded. The company downsized. "And the others?" He looked away. "They didn't work out." I nodded. Nothing more. Halfway through the interview, he stopped talking. Instead, he looked around my office through the glass walls. Employees walked confidently between meeting rooms. Phones rang. People laughed. The company felt alive. Finally, he looked back at me. "You built all this?" "Yes." "By yourself?" I smiled. "Not anymore. Now I have an incredible team." He lowered his eyes. For a moment, he looked embarrassed. Then quietly he asked, "How?" I thought about that question. 5 years earlier, I would have answered differently. Back then, I would have listed every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every rejection. But now, my answer was simple. I stopped believing the things other people said about me. He looked at me, as if those words landed somewhere deep inside him. The interview continued for another 20 minutes. When it ended, I closed his file. "Thank you for coming in." He didn't stand. Instead, he quietly asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Are you happy?" It was such an unexpected question that I laughed. Not at him. Just because life has a strange sense of humor. 5 years ago, happiness meant keeping my marriage together. Today, it meant something completely different. I looked him in the eyes. "Yes, I really am." He nodded slowly. "I'm glad." For the first time since he entered the room, his voice sounded genuine. Not defensive. Not arrogant. Just honest. He stood to leave, then stopped at the door. "I owe you an apology." I didn't answer. He continued anyway. "When I left, I convinced myself I was chasing a better life." He smiled sadly. "But I was really chasing someone else's success." He looked down at the floor. "Victoria and I." He paused. It didn't last. I remained silent. After about 2 years, she left too. He laughed quietly. I guess I wasn't ambitious enough anymore. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only regret. He took a slow breath. "I treated you terribly." "Yes. I know. I was arrogant." "Yes. I thought success came from standing next to powerful people." He looked around the office one more time. "You proved me wrong." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. "I saw your magazine cover." I raised an eyebrow. "So that was how you found us?" He nodded. I almost didn't apply. "Why did you?" He thought for several seconds. "Because deep down, I hoped you'd become the kind of leader I never was." That answer surprised me. Not because it erased the past. Nothing could. But because it sounded honest. Before leaving, he looked at me one last time. "You remember what I said the day I left?" I nodded. "I remember." He closed his eyes briefly. "I was wrong." His voice almost broke. "You didn't need me." "No," I answered softly. "I didn't." He gave one final nod, then quietly walked out of my office. "Thank you for coming in." He didn't stand. Instead, he quietly asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Are you happy?" It was such an unexpected question that I laughed. Not at him. Just because life has a strange sense of humor. 5 years ago, happiness meant keeping my marriage together. Today, it meant something completely different. I looked him in the eyes. "Yes, I really am." He nodded slowly. "I'm glad." For the first time since he entered the room, his voice sounded genuine. Not defensive. Not arrogant. Just honest. He stood to leave, then stopped at the door. "I owe you an apology." I didn't answer. He continued anyway. "When I left, I convinced myself I was chasing a better life." He smiled sadly. "But I was really chasing someone else's success." He looked down at the floor. "Victoria and I." He paused. It didn't last. I remained silent. After about 2 years, she left too. He laughed quietly. I guess I wasn't ambitious enough anymore. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only regret. He took a slow breath. "I treated you terribly." "Yes. I know. I was arrogant." "Yes. I thought success came from standing next to powerful people." He looked around the office one more time. "You proved me wrong." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. "I saw your magazine cover." I raised an eyebrow. "So that was how you found us?" He nodded. I almost didn't apply. "Why did you?" He thought for several seconds. "Because deep down, I hoped you'd become the kind of leader I never was." That answer surprised me. Not because it erased the past. Nothing could. But because it sounded honest. Before leaving, he looked at me one last time. "You remember what I said the day I left?" I nodded. I remember. He closed his eyes briefly. I was wrong. His voice almost broke. You didn't need me. No. I answered softly. I didn't. He gave one final nod, then quietly walked out of my office. Melissa came in a few minutes later. Well, she asked, are we hiring him? I looked down at his resume. His experience was solid. But leadership wasn't only about skills. It was about character. I remembered the young employees in our company. People who trusted us. People building their futures. Finally, I closed the folder. No. Melissa waited for an explanation. I smiled. He deserves another chance. She looked confused. But it won't be here. She nodded, understanding immediately. This wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. The next morning, I wrote him a recommendation letter. Not because he had been a good husband. He hadn't. But because bitterness wasn't the person I wanted to become. A week later, I heard he'd accepted a position at another company. I was genuinely happy for him. Life had taught him lessons, just as it had taught me mine. Several months later, I was invited to speak at a business conference. During the question and answer session, a young woman stood up. She looked nervous. My fiancé says I'll never succeed without him. The room became silent. I smiled, because I knew exactly how those words felt. I looked at her and said, never let someone else's opinion become your identity. If someone truly loves you, they'll build your confidence, not destroy it. The audience applauded. But I wasn't speaking only to her. I was speaking to the younger version of myself. The woman who believed she wasn't enough. She never got to hear those words. So I said them anyway. For her. For anyone who's ever been underestimated. Because sometimes, the greatest success isn't becoming richer than the people who hurt you. It isn't getting revenge. It isn't watching them regret their choices. The greatest success is waking up one day and realizing their opinion no longer matters. And that's when I finally understood something. Daniel didn't make me successful. Leaving him didn't make me successful either. The real turning point came the day I stopped waiting for someone else to believe in me, and finally believed in myself. In the end, the best comeback isn't making someone regret losing you. It's building a life so fulfilling that you no longer need their approval. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs this reminder today. Red Heart.